The U.S. military has opened fire, destroying a Venezuelan vessel carrying illegal substances. And this is only the beginning. This was the statement made by Donald Trump at the White House on September 2nd, escalating the already hostile relations between Washington and Caracas to a new level of tension. Just days earlier, in August, the powerful U.S. naval fleet had approached the Venezuelan coast under the pretext of combating drug trafficking, while Caracas asserted that it was merely an excuse for intimidation. In response, Venezuela deployed unmanned warships and mobilized up to 4.5 million militia members, ready to take up arms. The confrontation intensified when President Nicolás Maduro suddenly pulled out a Huawei phone, a gift from Xi Jinping, to boast that he had directly connected with Beijing via satellite. What seemed like a small detail raised a much bigger question. Was this merely symbolic posturing, or a signal that China would step in if Venezuela truly called for help? Would the U.S. dare to strike? And if war broke out, would Beijing intervene to rescue its distant ally across the globe? Welcome to KyHuynh Insights. The U.S. wants to take down Venezuela because of China. On the social platform Just Social, Trump announced that U.S. forces had eliminated a vessel identified as belonging to the notorious organization Chandra Arawa, operating within the area of responsibility of the U.S. Southern Command. All 11 suspects aboard the vessel were killed, with no American casualties. Chandra Arawa is no stranger to the international community. The organization was once listed by the United Nations as one of the most dangerous criminal groups in Latin America, with operations spanning Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. Washington placed Chandra Arawa on its elimination list in February of this year, labeling it a direct threat to regional security. According to DEA reports, this group controls multiple smuggling routes for illegal substances worldwide, while also engaging in various other criminal activities such as forced labor, extortion, and human trafficking. Immediately after the incident, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the illegal cargo on the high-speed boat was likely en route to Trinidad or other Caribbean nations before continuing its journey into the U.S. He emphasized that this action demonstrated President Donald Trump's stance of moving beyond mere defense, actively striking drug cartels and cutting them off directly at the source. This strategy marks a sharp departure from the old approach, which mainly focused on intercepting operations within U.S. territory. Washington has repeatedly accused the Chandra Arawa cartels of having ties to President Nicolás Maduro's government. Caracas, however, has denied these allegations, claiming that the group was dismantled during Operation Triquet in 2023. Despite these claims, international observers remain skeptical. After the Triquet operation, several smaller branches of Chandra Arawa continued operating in neighboring countries. The U.S. military action came just weeks after Washington significantly increased its presence in the Caribbean, deploying 7 warships, 1 nuclear attack submarine, and more than 4,500 troops and Marines, officially under the pretext of combating Latin American drug cartels. But is Washington truly focused only on dismantling drug trafficking networks? Or is there a deeper, more strategic motive behind these moves? Looking at the global geopolitical map, Latin America has long been considered Washington's strategic backyard. In this picture, Venezuela stands out above all others, not only because it holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 303 billion barrels according to OPEC's 2022 data, but also because of its prime location at the gateway to the Caribbean. It sits right next to the vital Panama Canal shipping route and wields considerable influence over the political and security landscape of the entire region. For the United States, Venezuela represents far more than just an oil hub. It is a critical intersection of many strategic interests. The 20th century saw a period of warm relations between the two nations. As early as the 1920s, American corporations set foot in Caracas to exploit its massive oil fields. During World War II and throughout the Cold War, when oil became the lifeblood fueling industrial and military power, Venezuela was considered an irreplaceable partner. From 1940 to 1980, Caracas consistently ranked among the top oil suppliers to the U.S., while Washington served as Venezuela's primary export market. The relationship was so close that Venezuela was often referred to as the Saudi Arabia of South America. However, this prosperity also led to excessive dependence. After the oil boom of the 1970s, Venezuela's economy became distorted, almost entirely dependent on black gold, while its industrial and agricultural sectors weakened. When oil prices plummeted in the 1980s, the country sank into a crisis of debt, corruption, and social unrest. It was during this turbulent time that Hugo Chavez emerged. Once a military officer involved in a failed coup attempt in 1992, Chavez quickly rose to become a symbol of resistance against the US-aligned elite. In 1998, he won the presidential election, ushering in an era of direct confrontation with Washington. Upon taking power, Chavez nationalized a wide range of industries, particularly the oil and gas sector, seizing control from American corporations that had long benefited from Venezuela's resources. He used oil revenues to fund social programs, winning the loyalty of the poor. On the international stage, Chavez openly criticized the United States, even going so far as to call President George W. Bush a devil at the United Nations. From that point forward, Venezuela firmly positioned itself in opposition to the world's leading superpower. However, the story did not remain just between the US and Venezuela. A third player entered the picture, one that greatly unsettled Washington: China. When Chavez launched his vision of 21st century Bolivarianism, he didn't merely oppose the US, he also sought alternative partners. During the era of high oil prices, Venezuela's petroleum revenues were sufficient to sustain its social programs. But starting in 2008, oil prices collapsed. Corruption and poor governance plunged Venezuela into a severe crisis. US sanctions further strangled the country, forcing Caracas to seek an external lifeline, and Beijing extended its hand. China had long harbored ambitions of expanding its influence in Latin America, aiming to break Washington's monopoly over the region. With its vast oil reserves and a government eager to cooperate, Venezuela was the perfect target. As early as the 2000s, Beijing poured tens of billions of dollars into Caracas in the form of preferential loans. The structure of these loans was highly unusual. China lent Venezuela tens of billions of dollars, and in return, Venezuela had to repay with oil over many years. This meant Venezuela's oil was no longer fully under its control. It effectively became collateral for the debt owed to Beijing. Chinese loans always came with strings attached. Venezuela was required to use Chinese contractors, equipment, and labor, meaning that much of the loan money flowed straight back into the pockets of Chinese corporations before it ever reached Venezuela's domestic economy. As a result, ordinary Venezuelans saw little to no benefit from these projects, while the country's debt continued to skyrocket. China skillfully created a vicious cycle: debt and oil. Venezuela borrowed money, repaid with oil, then borrowed again to cover deficits, only to once again repay with oil. Beijing also used Venezuela's economic desperation to expand its influence into many other sectors. China funded a series of major infrastructure projects, ranging from railways and power plants to telecommunications. Chinese companies, such as Huawei, became deeply embedded, not only providing technology, but also assisting the Venezuelan government in surveillance and social control. For example, Venezuela's government rolled out a digital national ID system built with Chinese technology. This system enabled the state to track personal information and allocate goods and services based on citizens' level of loyalty to the regime. In essence, Venezuela was importing China's model of social control, turning the country into a testing ground for surveillance technologies. Naturally, the United States could not sit idly by. Opposing the US might result only in economic sanctions, but openly aligning with China crossed a red line that Washington could not ignore. Especially under Donald Trump, anything related to Beijing was a thorn in the White House's side. Because of this, America's recent military actions could very well be a retaliatory move against Caracas for growing closer to China. But the big question remains: if war breaks out, will Russia, China, or North Korea get involved? As Washington deploys warships near Venezuela and launches a single strike, tensions in the region grow thick, evoking memories of past US military interventions in Latin America. The pressing question is, will the US actually dare to strike Venezuela outright? From a theoretical standpoint, we first need to understand the sheer scale of Washington's power. The U.S. defense budget in 2023 surpassed $860 billion, nearly 300 times larger than Venezuela's, which stood at only around $3 billion. The U.S. Navy operates over 490 vessels, including 11 aircraft carriers and nearly 70 nuclear-powered submarines, while Venezuela's Navy consists of only a few outdated frigates from the 1970s. In terms of air power, the U.S. maintains over 13,000 military aircraft, compared to Venezuela's roughly 280 planes. Just the U.S. forces currently deployed near Venezuela: 7 warships, 1 nuclear attack submarine, 2,000 Marines, and P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft, already far outmatch Venezuela's entire Navy. With this imbalance, Washington could easily dominate the skies and the Caribbean Sea if a direct war were to erupt. However, war isn't solely about raw strength. Being stronger does not guarantee victory. While Venezuela cannot match the U.S., it still ranks among the most capable militaries in Latin America. It has over 120,000 active troops, millions of Bolivarian militia members, and 3 key Russian-supplied arsenals: Su-30 Mk2 fighter jets, S-300 VM air defense systems, Bastion coastal defense missile systems, T-72B1V tanks. These assets could inflict heavy casualties if the U.S. attempted a massive bombing campaign or amphibious assault. More importantly, the Venezuelan military is fiercely loyal to President Nicolás Maduro. They have weathered numerous coup attempts, from the 2019 uprising to several covert operations allegedly backed by the U.S. This proves that Venezuela's forces will not be easily subdued. Moreover, a war with Venezuela would be extremely costly. Even though the U.S. maintains a base in Honduras, to launch a direct strike on Caracas, they would have to cover a distance of over 20,200 kilometers, requiring massive logistical support and heavy reliance on countries like Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica. However, not every nation is willing to become a launching pad for U.S. operations. The ghosts of Afghanistan and Iraq still linger. Trillions of dollars spent, tens of thousands of lives lost, yet the outcome was nothing but endless wars, with no clear victory. Venezuela, on the other hand, is far from isolated. Russia has supplied advanced weapons, sent military advisors for training and maintenance of defense systems. China has poured in tens of billions of dollars, becoming both Venezuela's biggest creditor and a strategic partner in the oil sector. Even North Korean leader Kim Jong-un recently declared his willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder with Caracas in a fight for peace. If the U.S. actually fired the first shot, it would mean directly striking at the interests of Russia, China, and North Korea, 3 major adversaries of the West. The consequences would extend far beyond a regional conflict, potentially causing global oil prices to skyrocket and directly threatening the U.S. economy. Equally important, countries in the region do not want war spreading to their soil. Mexico has repeatedly called for peaceful solutions. The Organization of American States, OAS, and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, have unanimously opposed military intervention, emphasizing the principle of sovereignty. No one wants a catastrophic conflict to erupt in an already fragile region. For this reason, Maduro's government believes that Washington's military maneuvers are more about showing force and intimidation than actually preparing for a full-scale war. At least for now, the likelihood of the U.S. launching a comprehensive war remains distant. However, let us imagine the worst-case scenario. If war does break out and the U.S. decides to strike Venezuela, what would happen? First, during the initial preparation phase, Washington would not act alone. The U.S. would deploy additional warships, strategic bombers, and special forces closer to the Caribbean region. Simultaneously, they would launch an information campaign, accusing Maduro's government of aiding drug cartels. Neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil could be drawn in to increase pressure from the borders. Meanwhile, Caracas will not stand idle. With over 120,000 regular troops, millions of Bolivarian militia, and advanced defense systems like the S-300 VM air defense system, Bastion coastal defense missiles, and a fleet of Su-30 Mk2 fighter jets, Venezuela would place its entire military on high alert. If conflict erupts, the U.S. would exploit its overwhelming advantage in air and naval power. Nuclear submarines, destroyers, and Tomahawk missile launchers would strike Venezuela's critical targets, including weapons depots, military bases, oil refineries, and other strategic facilities, similar to Washington's strike on Iran in June. P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft would provide real-time intelligence, increasing the precision of these attacks. At sea, Venezuela's Navy would stand little chance against the superior U.S. fleet. However, if Washington chooses to launch a ground invasion toward Caracas or Maracaibo, they would face tanks, rocket artillery, and guerrilla warfare waged by millions of militia fighters. The aftermath of war would be catastrophic. Whether the U.S. wins quickly or Venezuela manages to hold out, thousands of lives would be lost. Venezuela's oil infrastructure, the nation's lifeline, would be devastated, causing global oil prices to skyrocket. The global refining industry, including that of the U.S., would suffer severe disruptions. A humanitarian crisis could drive millions of Venezuelans to flee into Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, triggering a massive migration wave. In the U.S., the enormous costs of war would inflate the national debt, deepen political divisions, and damage America's international reputation, especially given that regional countries have opposed military intervention from the start. In summary, while the U.S. might achieve swift victories in the initial strikes, the risk of becoming bogged down in a prolonged conflict is nearly inevitable. Thus, the likelihood of direct military action at this moment remains very low. The more practical strategy for Washington would be to continue its traditional approach: sanctions, economic isolation, and pressure campaigns to force Caracas to make concessions on oil policy or adjust its ties with Russia and China. If war truly breaks out, it would be a catastrophe not only for Venezuela, but for the entire region and the world.